welcome to this session. And the focus of this session is on examining the current models and estimation procedures and institutions and the regulatory framework, whether they are potentially applicable to the offshore wind situation. And I've been working with lawyers over the years on various economic valuation and compensation studies. And so all of the studies has been conducted within a multidisciplinary framework, either sort of a bioeconomic, geoeconomics, and then with the regulatory institutional analysis. So today we are very fortunate to have three distinguished speakers who are talking about those specifics in how to quantify the economic impact and how to quantify the dollar values for compensation. And then once you have the dollar values estimated, then how do you transfer those payments to the recipients? Then how do you make sure all the dollars are spent on restoration, on all the other relevant social projects? And then the institutional framework. So the devil is in the details. So I think I'm going to introduce each of the speakers right before their talk so that you remember their background and then their experience. So our first speaker is Jason Kinnell, who is the president and founding partner of Veritas Economics. He has a tremendous track record in conducting economic impact analysis, regulatory compliance analysis, and relevant economic damage assessment analysis. And then he has studied over 100 project sites in the United States, from North Carolina all the way through the Gulf of Maine, and from here in the United States all the way to Europe. And so his talk is going to be on an overview of the damage assessment modeling and estimation, and with several specific application examples. Jason.
So in the United States, if you have an oil spill, we have an oil spill or a hazardous release, the responsible party is not only responsible for paying the cleanup costs of that oil spill or that hazardous release, but they are also responsible to compensate the public for the lost interim services, either ecological or human use services. And that process takes place in the natural resource damage assessment and restoration evaluation framework. And what I would like to do this afternoon or this morning is give you an overview of that process from the regulatory standpoint, then also talk a little bit about the scientific components of how we actually try and go about measuring changes in ecological services to calculate damages, and then the benefits of restoration. Because this is focused on net positive impacts for biodiversity, I'm going to focus only on ecological service damages and ecological service improvements. But as we've heard over the past couple of days, and I think earlier this morning when folks were talking about what their biggest fear is, we hear the commercial fishing industry. Those are human use services. And so all of the concepts that I'm talking about also are applicable to different types of human use services, quantified in different ways, but I just wanted to let you know damage assessment, my focus is going to be on ecological services, but damage assessment covers ecological and human use. After I kind of cover the overview of NRD, I want to give you, sorry, that was jargon, natural resource damage assessment. After I cover that, I want to talk about a very specific example that my business partner and others at Veritas worked on in North Carolina that has a very interesting endangered species component to it, in which the responsible party, Duke Energy, was really incentivized to try and focus on some endangered species restoration and how we incorporate that into the damage assessment. And then I'll just leave you with some concluding thoughts on, at least in the work that we've done on damage assessment, and then what we see in working on construction and operation plans for offshore wind, how there can be a potential, how there can be usefulness with respect to damage assessment of bringing some of those components into the offshore wind development process. And I'm thinking specifically into the regulatory components of a COP, but there could be larger concepts as well. Let's see if I can do lesson 1 and advance my slide. I did, okay. So just some very high-level overview of the typical steps in a natural resource damage assessment. The first is the injury determination, where here what we're asking is the question of whether or not there's been a hazardous substance that's been released that can injure natural resource services, natural resources or ecological services. If the answer to that question is yes, we move on to an assessment phase where we're effectively going, okay, there is a chemical out there, but has it injured natural resources and or affected services? Again, if yes, we're moving into a damage determination where what we want to do is now quantify, okay, how much have natural resources or ecological services been affected? And if you don't remember anything from my talk, the last slide is the last step is what I really want you to take home, which is this is a restoration-based rule. So at the end, yes, we're calculating damages, but it really only is half of the process, and I'll illustrate this in a moment, because then what we're asking is, okay, well, what's the cost to restore, rehabilitate, replace, or acquire the equivalent lost resources or affected services? And that restoration component is a very important component of the damage assessment process. So how do we do this? So this is going to be a very conceptual overview of the process, but just to orient you to the graph, on the horizontal axis we have time, and on the vertical axis we have some level of natural resources or ecological and human use services. So natural resources, you can think about it in terms of, we talked about birds a lot yesterday, we talked about fish this morning. Human use services, you can think about it in terms of fishing trips and quality of fishing trips. So envision an area that has a level of baseline services. For simplicity, it's flat. It's continuing at its same level, often to time, at a constant rate. And then we have a point at where either an oil spill occurs or there is a release of a hazardous substance, and so injury begins. Then over time, you see those baseline services decline to get to a point, let's see if I get my pointer, get to a point where maybe it flattens out, and then it starts to increase. Usually this point of increase is because remediation is taking place, and what we have with that line is effectively our with injury service level. The difference between those two areas is effectively our area of quantifying damages. Well, I said that that's only half of the process. The other half then is, okay, well, what level of restoration do we need to undertake, and how do we go about estimating those benefits? Well, we think conceptually in the same way. If we have a location either in the area that's been affected or in an adjacent area where some restoration can be done, we look at increases in the level of services or natural resources that can occur with that project. Those are our with restoration services. That area effectively represents the increase in those resources or ecological services and represents our restoration benefits. If the area of that green polygon is larger than the area of the white polygon, we effectively have net positive impact. Now you may be sitting there saying, okay, Jason, you gave us 2 polygons, that's great. Well, how do you actually measure these polygons? Well, with respect to ecological services within damage assessment, The main technique that we like to use is resource equivalency analysis. And so I'm expecting Mel, now Mel's taking a picture of my slide, and I was expecting Mel to actually go, we don't want to do any equivalency measures, and you're an economist, why are you up there talking about equivalency measures, you know, when she's I don't know if you're an ecologist, you said there was some social component, but also some hard science in there, and I was fascinated that you had an ecologist talking about payments and then payment plans, and you've got an economist talking about equivalency measures. But within the damage assessment process, this is a technique that we like to use. It's tried and true within the damage assessment framework. And we especially like to focus on resource equivalency analysis because it's focusing on an individual species or a set of species. In terms of the measurement unit that we like to use, we use something called a discounted service acre year. And so the discounting is to recognize that the damages and the benefits of restoration are taking place at different points of time, and we want to try and equilibrate those so we can get them into a constant and comparative time-valued metric. That's what the discounting is for. The years is to recognize the understanding of when precisely have these damages occur, when are they starting, when are the with injury services returning to baseline, when is the restoration occurring, how long until it reaches its maximum, how long does it go into the future. And so getting all those really well nailed down and understood. The service acre years, or sorry, the service acres that's the point where all of you who are hard scientists, biologists, ecologists in the room, your expertise is critical. Because you are the individuals who come together, typically in a consensus form, and start to say, these are the species that we think matter, number one. These are the ways in which we have seen their habitat's been affected. We expect their ecological productivity to be affected. These are the restoration projects that we think that matter most. And this is what we see as the ecological productivity associated with the individual habitat that we want to evaluate from a restoration standpoint. And that becomes incredibly critical. I want to give you an example of how this was implemented for the Dan River coal ash spill in North Carolina, and a very particular project that was done, one of many, relative to this natural resource damage assessment. So the Dan River Steam Station is located in Eden, North Carolina, right on the border of Virginia and North Carolina. In February in 2014, it had a spill of 39,000 tons of coal ash into the Dan River. That coal ash migrated along the Dan River between North Carolina and Virginia to the Kerr Reservoir in Virginia. And the evaluation of the damage assessment was the entire Dan River watershed, focusing primarily on the river itself. But we were looking at primary ecological impacts to benthic habitat, benthic organisms, fish, and freshwater mussels. Within the river itself, there is a very particular endangered species that is of interest, that is the Roanoke log perch. And as we started going from the damage assessment to the restoration evaluation, what we found was that we could find decent restoration projects for freshwater mussels, fish, and benthic invertebrates, but we couldn't find as straightforward and easy projects. When I say easy, projects that were clear, had specific objectives and targets for how they would improve log perch. We couldn't find that specifically in the Dan River, but we looked to the Pig River watershed, which is, the point of this slide is to illustrate it's adjacent to the Dan River watershed, but it's not within it. And what we became aware of is that there was a hydroelectric plant that was built on the Pig River in 1915. It's been abandoned, I think, for the past 30 or 40 years. And there was a lot of interest in removing that dam to open up 70 miles of stream for general ecological improvement overall, but specifically to target improvement to the Roanoke log perch, again, which is an endangered species. That was one of the projects that was chosen for restoration. Construction equipment was brought in, the dam was removed, and now the river is returned to its natural kind of free-flowing state. The process of the damage assessment looked at all of the components of ecological loss and gains in the Dan River watershed, but also added in the ecological improvements to the Pig River. So in terms of applying this process, the natural resource damage assessment process to offshore wind, a couple of points that I want to make are, the first is that the process provides the ability to evaluate and directly compare the ecological and human use damages associated with environmental impacts, but it also allows you to do that relative to restoration benefits. And specifically, if you think back again to that process slide I laid out, that's the intent of the regulation, is really to get to that restoration component. It provides a useful framework for evaluating potential ecological mitigation projects for offshore wind, but there are some important components for offshore wind evaluation that I think we need to consider. And that the first is to focus on individual species. And as I've been sitting in this room across the past day and a half, that's a lot of what I've heard, is down to the individual species level. Within damage assessment and resource equivalency analysis, that's effectively what we're doing, is really trying to understand things at the species level. That measurement of potential impacts to those species needs to take in the timing of when those impacts are going to occur, both on the damages and the restoration front. Why is that important? Well, as we were listening yesterday to descriptions of Thor's hammer, trying to nail in, that's my engineering technical word for pile driving, I guess. But to pile drive these 40-foot pylons, you've got acoustic impacts that are potentially going to affect right whale migration, and that's going to happen not at the point when the turbines are active, but are going to happen at the point when, thank you very much, when they're being constructed. And so that timing is important relative to, if you've got concerns over right whales, you might want to be thinking about that earlier in the process than, say, bird strikes that are going to occur when the turbines become operational. So that timing's important relative to its relationship with the species. The other thing that I want to note is relative to optimal restoration location. Sometimes the best restoration is not in the location where the damages occur. And we saw that specifically with the Roanoke log perch, with the example that I gave yesterday. And Aspen gave a nice example yesterday of bird restoration projects in South America that are specifically focused on potentially offsetting bird strikes in California. And again, the damage assessment process has the ability to take that disparity or that difference in the spatial location of impacts and benefits and build it into the consideration of how much quantification has not only been enough, but relative to this particular conference, how could it go above and beyond and lead to net positive impacts? The last thing that I wanted to note that occurred to me yesterday that I didn't add to the slide was the notion that damage assessment, at least from the damage component, is backward-looking. So we're concerned with something that's already happened, but the restoration component is forward-looking. Well, that's very similar to the NEPA process. The NEPA process is forward-looking. We're going to build something. We're thinking about building something. What's going to happen? Another component about the damage assessment process that's really useful relative to NEPA is that the damage assessment is very focused on understanding what are the baseline conditions of this particular natural resource or these ecological services, and how have those baseline services been reduced relative to the with injury services or the with injury impacts. That comparison of baseline and with injury is effectively very similar to the no action condition under NEPA, which is effectively your baseline, we're not going to do anything, but what's going to happen in this system if we don't do anything over time. And then all your alternatives analysis is very similar to that with injury analysis. Damage assessment, I think, has been going on effectively for 40 years. There's a lot of history, a lot of richness. And so I think as folks are thinking through how we can take environmental mitigation into context in developing construction and operation plans, there's a lot of richness there that could be useful for informing how we get to net positive impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Our next speaker is Michelle Mattson. Michelle is an ecologist and a compensatory mitigation subject matter expert with Army Corps of Engineers Institute for Water Resources. She has over 2 decades of experience working on projects involving ecosystem restoration. Specifically site assessment, regulatory compliance, and she also has been involved in supporting training courses at the regional, national, and international levels. And she's been in the field working with restoration teams, solving complex problems with creative solutions. So Michelle will discuss course compensatory mitigation programs, including mitigation banking. Michelle.
Okay, is this the guy that will go forward? Yes. Where does it go? Okay, let me try the other one. There we go. Hi. So Michelle Mattson with the Institute for Water Resources, and this is a topic, compensatory mitigation, that I teach all the time. This is the most boring of the sessions that we teach because this is the overview of the Corps and the EPA's compensatory mitigation rule. After coming yesterday and listening to many of the speakers this morning, I was scrambling to put a couple of the things in there because I learned a lot. And before this, I knew very little at all about offshore wind, and I still know very little. But I was asked to come and talk about the Corps program and maybe how it could be used as a template or used as is, in some cases, to provide compensatory mitigation, and particularly third-party compensatory mitigation through mitigation banking or in-lieu programs, which Ainsling will talk to. Okay, so the compensatory mitigation rule was passed in 2008 after about 10 years, at least 5, but 10 years of studying the Corps and the EPA's program, Section 404 compensatory mitigation program, and by academics, and realizing that there were significant let's just say, many poorly cited and executed compensatory mitigation sites that were just failing at replacing lost impacts. And so the rule has some pretty specific goals. So sustainable compensatory mitigation was number 1, right? And so it includes things like long-term management, funding long-term management, pretty intensive short-term monitoring, but then that monitoring also going into long-term monitoring, as well as adaptive management. So lots of adaptive management has been talked about. We need to do this. We need to be able to change things over time as new data comes in. That is something that the Corps strives for. We probably fail. We do get a lot of pushback about how much that costs, but there are ways around that. And I'm going to zoom past some of this stuff. Okay, so the purpose was primarily to create standards and criteria that were equivalent across the different types of compensatory mitigation. So that is permitted responsible mitigation, which most mitigation used to be provided by the applicant. So that would be the permittee. And in these small, sort of what we call, postage size stamp mitigation sites, it was maybe a lot or two that they decided, okay, we'll give you this and we'll build a basin and that'll be your compensatory mitigation. Well, these were disconnected, didn't really provide very good ecological value. They would have the HOA monitor and manage it. So as you can imagine, this did not replace lost functions and services of a stream or a wetland, right? So bankers really pushed Congress and the Corps and the EPA to make sure that PRM had to meet the same standards that banks and in-lieu fee sites did. And they have so much more science and effort that goes into site identification, monitoring, and whatnot. Okay, so there's been some discussion here about, or a lot of discussion here about mitigation hierarchy. And that's been used as, avoid, minimize, and then compensate or compensatory mitigation. For us, that is the permit sequencing, right? So all projects are supposed to go through first avoid, minimize, before they can even propose or talk about compensatory mitigation. So the hierarchy I'm going to talk about is our preference hierarchy of first using mitigation banks, then in-lieu fee programs, then PRM on-site, in-kind, and then off-site, and so on. So again, words matter. Someone said that a lot. So words matter. Definitions are required so that we are all using the same language. Oh crap! What was that? What did I do? Okay, so lots of definitions in the mitigation rule. The new ones that I wanted to point out was that the Corps and the EPA tried to define adaptive management. Advanced credits are something that are used for in-lieu fee programs. So those are credits that are allowed to be sold prior to actually being in the ground. Temporal loss, getting to that time difference between when impacts occur and when a compensatory mitigation site is just in the ground, but when it meets ecological performance standards. The watershed approach, which there are nuances there for marine systems, and then what is a watershed plan? Okay, so requirements, lots of requirements in the mitigation rule regarding all aspects of what a compensatory mitigation site or what a mitigation plan should include. So none of this is going to be, surprising, but some of the really great things that were included were things like buffers. So if you're talking about stream or estuary restoration, providing credit to an applicant for buffer area made a lot of sense because it improved the functions and services of that site. And so if you're going to require it, from a regulatory side, if you're going to require it, you need to provide credit for it. So that was a huge advance for us. Timing of project limitation, short-term financial, so lots about financial assurances to ensure that the site actually gets installed, that it gets done well, and then long-term funding for fixing it if things go wrong, because we don't always know how a site will perform. Okay, so the type and location of mitigation was a pretty substantial change from compensatory mitigation prior to 2008. And it really focuses on this idea of watershed approach and lays out things that regulators and applicants should consider: habitat diversity, connectivity, a lot of these terms that you guys have been using so far, land use trends, what's on the horizon, so that the site wouldn't be impacted if you can help it in the future. And then there are exceptions for marine resources. So here's just an example of a different type of service area or approach to sort of looking at a region versus a specific terrestrial watershed. And so this is in San Diego. It's a San Diego Bay. Impacts in one part of the bay are allowed to be mitigated in the other part of the bay versus just around one specific project site. The Southern California bight, is sort of defined by this sort of larger littoral cell, and mitigation is allowed across estuaries throughout the whole Southern California bight because every estuary cannot provide all of the resources or all of the functions and services that are needed. So on-site, I guess all of this gets to on-site in kind is not always the best for the resources. And so the rule allows that flexibility. In fact, actually proposes to instead do off-site, larger, more ecologically higher function restoration than doing small on-site restoration. So I don't want to read all of this, way too many words on here, but the watershed approach is really just a general framework for better decision making, right? Look at the landscape perspective, take in all of the ecological processes. So when I was asked to come and talk about this, the first thing that came to mind when I was asking, like, what does offshore mean? I mean, I literally had to Google what is offshore defined. I'm like, I'm dealing with all of this. Like, are you talking about 3 miles, 5 miles? What are you talking about? And they're like 10 miles offshore. I'm like, whoa, okay. And as an ecologist, my mind went to a lot of the things. There have been multiple other people here talking about, well, restore estuaries. It's all one big system. I'm not saying that that's the right answer for this program. Shoot, oh my God, 3 minutes. But, and I'll just skip the rest. But I look at this, I look at every system sort of as a whole, right? And how there are all these connections. You're impacting mammals, okay, they eat fish spawn in estuaries. We have climate change and sea level rise. One of the biggest challenges that we have right now is estuary loss, historic estuary loss, and current estuary loss from sea level rise, and not having buffer areas so that they can't migrate because of land uses that we've built up. So can we focus some of this funding, compensatory mitigation, on things that we really need at the sort of end of our watersheds in estuaries? And I would advise in investing in historic ecology. There's a wonderful historic ecology evaluation done in California by the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project and SFEI. Awesome tools to use in planning a coastal ecosystem restoration project so that you don't get things like this. I always pick on Bolsa Chica. Look it up, it's hideous. This is what in kind looks like, okay? So impacts at a port for open water and nymphs. I hope there are no nymphs, people here ready to throw tomatoes at me. No problem. It was one person in particular. Anyway, this was a long time ago, and it was, and the thought before at this time was, and this was pre-2008, right, was open water for open water, no exceptions, no exceptions. So we have this huge basin, and this is not the only one, there's like 4 in Southern California alone. Huge basins, got rid of actual wetlands, and with sea level rise, it's gonna get worse. And they spend about $400,000 a year dredging the inlet to keep it as open water. It's horrible, in my opinion. Okay, and there's all the details. You can look it up, it's horrible. This is what Bolsa Chica looked like historically. Okay, can all of that be restored? No, we have existing conditions, but this could have helped them design something that actually functioned naturally, sustainably, and saved us, millions of dollars so far, in just dredging the inlet. So, looking broader, better. Okay, this is our preference hierarchy. Mitigation bank credits, why? They have way more science behind them. They're done in advance of impacts. They have credits available to be sold. So regulators don't have to deal with their applicants and identifying a site, restoring it, monitoring it for 10 plus years, and being an economist and estimating how much it costs to manage that site in perpetuity, which we know that that's not real. Anyway, and then in-lieu fee program credits, similar to bank credits, but there's a time difference, and Ainsley's gonna go through that. Then permittee responsible under the watershed approach, on-site in kind, off-site out of kind. I would argue for you guys, off-site out of kind, probably the best option, again, in my opinion. Let's see, where am I? Preservation criteria, we don't need this. Relationship to other programs, I'm out of time. Every mitigation plan has to have these 12 components, okay? And this is just the basics for so all PRM has to have this, all banks, in-lieu fee programs, every site. But bankers have a whole other slew of things that they have to provide, right? An analysis of where impacts are occurring and how they would replace those. We don't see their financials, we see the financials for in-lieu fee programs. But we do work with them and look at the financials for long-term management planning, because that has to include monitoring, site protection, legal fees, I mean, you name it, right? It just, there's a lot of money that then has to be put away, invested, so that the interest is spent on managing and monitoring it and doing that adaptive management that's needed. What else? Oh, this is the performance standards, monitoring, lots of monitoring. My favorite part, and this is just my little fancy art. This is as good as it gets. Just wanted to point out that adaptive management happens at all times, right? And adaptive management, actually I should have another little circle up there by performance standards. Often in the past, we had performance standards that were set, through negotiations with regulators. I started at the Army Corps in 2008, brought over there by my previous mentors and managers who helped write the rule to implement the rule in LA District. And the first thing I saw was that our regulators had never been in the field, did not know what an ecological performance standards should be, and they were going in and they were requiring things that a site would never achieve. So example that comes to mind, Santa Margarita River, went out there, they had a requirement for large woody debris. That they don't have large woody debris in Santa Margarita River watershed. It's a sandy braided system right through Camp Pendleton. So I had to rewrite that permit condition. So anyway, adaptive management occurs at all times through the life cycle of a restoration site, compensatory mitigation site, whatever, and we need to plan for that. Regulators need to be flexible and allow for that, and applicants have to fund, have enough funding for that. And I think I'm done. Oh no, management. Lots of legal mumbo jumbo for mitigation bankers. And one thing on there I do want to point out, interagency review team. So we get lots of criticism for this. This does slow down the process, but the interagency review team is, all of the regulatory and resource agencies that approve that bank. So if it's on the coast, NIMS, any DOA or DOE, Fish and Game, Corps, EPA, all of us, the ones that give y'all trouble. And that's it. Oh, and this was just like my argument for a database. Build a database, not just for where your sites are located like we have, but for that raw data. We require so much data to be collected. Tons of money is spent, and we get it in a monitoring report with rolled up maps and graphs, and we have to ask for the raw data. But even when we get that raw data in Excel spreadsheet, we have nowhere to put it. So we can't adapt our program based on lessons learned. I have a whole suite of great bankers who will give me their data and let us analyze it and whatnot, but we need a place to have that so that in the future, like when I was young and I just told the story outside, and I needed a reference curve for a stream restoration project, I had to go out and collect all of that data at a bunch of different sites and map my curves on my own, right? If I needed a reference site, I had to crawl all over an area and find a reference site. We need this stuff to be more readily available so that we can do site selection more effectively, so that academics can look at that data and learn from it. And that applicant's long gone, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we want to be able to do things better and differently, and we can't do that without access to the data that's being required. And I think that's it. I'm off my soapbox. So there's our information. These other people are fabulous. My coworker Ribbit manages Ribbits, and she'll answer all of your questions about our database.
Thank you, Michelle. Our third speaker is Aisling O'Shea. She's a program administrator for the Massachusetts Department of Fish and Game. She manages the in-lieu fee program from the site selection, funding, collaboration with federal, state, and other partners, and all the way through program outcome evaluation. Prior to her current position, she worked for more than 20 years on environmental policy and planning in Massachusetts. So Aisling is to talk about the Massachusetts in-lieu fee program with restoration project examples. Aisling.
All right. Hi, everybody. Lots to say about in-lieu fee and mitigation programs, and I was at one of those great training programs, so I know we could talk about it for a week, but I know we only have a few minutes, and everybody's probably hungry. So I'm going to talk about the in-lieu fee program in Massachusetts, which is a fairly new program. There are many of them out there across the state. Ours it was established in 2014. So Massachusetts Department of Fish and Game is the Army Corps of Engineers approved Massachusetts DFG as the sponsor for an in-lieu fee program. I'm not going to go into this just to highlight that, we collect, under the mitigation rule as a sponsor, we're responsible on the financial side to collect the fees. The Corps decides which permittees have to pay a fee and how much they have to mitigate for. Is it 100 feet of stream or a quarter of an acre of freshwater or estuarine wetlands? The fees were set at the time that the instrument was established. We're reevaluating those now. And under the mitigation rule, we have a certain amount of time, 3 growing seasons, 3 years, where we want to try and achieve the mitigation within that time frame to reduce the temporal delay. So as I mentioned, the program was started in 2014, and the first mitigation project was in 2017, was an eelgrass restoration project. And that's because it took a few years, like money starts coming in, but you don't have enough necessarily to do a full project. Most of the impacts and the payments that are made are in our coastal area. We have 4 service areas. Michelle mentioned, how that the service areas are developed where you can buy and sell credits within. In Massachusetts, just most of the impact is happening in the coastal area, and most of the money coming in, we didn't necessarily have enough in the western region to do a project, so that took a bit longer. So I'd say about half the money in the coastal area it's split about 50-50 between freshwater impacts and tidal impacts. So I'm going to focus on the tidal here. So between our first project in 2017 and now, we have 6 coastal restoration. I'm talking about tidal restoration projects. We do have other freshwater projects in the coastal area. So we have about 6 tidal projects underway right now. So just to sort of build on this sort of conversation that, over the last few days, and some things that Michelle mentioned too about in-kind versus out-of-kind. As we began these conversations a few years ago with our interagency review team and the Corps, federal and state agencies involved in that IRT, many conversations about what is appropriate, what's the most appropriate way to spend this money. Some of the impacts were associated with dredging, fill, shading of eelgrass, replacement of fishing piers, things like that. What's the most appropriate way to do that, and how do we measure success? So the kinds of projects that we've identified were the eelgrass, also artificial reef, an oyster reef project, salt marsh restoration. These are the kinds of things we're looking at. So it's kind of we were kind of is refreshing, and we were kind of happy to hear that there's flexibility at the federal regulatory level to look at things that aren't exactly in kind. So perhaps some of the payments were for subtidal impacts, but we're combining these payments and trying to do the best kind of project to get the best ecological lift we can while meeting the compensatory mitigation requirements. So looking at opportunities in the nearshore area is really helpful too, because there's a lot to do as far as salt marsh restoration and eelgrass restoration. So I wanted to just take step back a bit and take a look at the big picture in terms of where Department of Fish and Game's in-lieu fee program kind of fits in, and how we interact, and how we're still developing our collaborations with other agencies and federal, state, NGOs, municipalities, potential partners. Because what we realize is, we have certain obligations to meet and a certain amount of money, but there's a lot of other really good things going on out there where there might be a need, and where we're looking at shared mission. We have a lot of common interests and priorities, climate, sea level rise, climate change, the salt, degraded salt marshes, fisheries resources. How can we kind of best collaborate to achieve some of these common interests? So while we're meeting the basic compensatory mitigation goals, whether it's a half an acre of tidal or freshwater wetlands, we're also looking at selecting projects in a way, what are our prioritization criteria? How do we select projects in a way where we can also achieve and think about the bigger picture, broader conservation management initiatives and climate change and things like that? And our Department of Fish and Game, we have 3 main divisions, and so they have their own expertise and their own programs that we're leveraging as well. So in the early years, we were doing mostly projects within our own divisions, looking at preservation projects and the eelgrass. We've expanded in the last couple of years, extending out and building the restoration partnerships with other groups. So I was going to give you a few very specific examples of some of these projects. So eelgrass restoration and the reefs. And so the Salem Sound Eelgrass Restoration Project, this is sponsored by our Division of Marine Fisheries. They already had work going on, both kind of research and some restoration work themselves, sort of an established base of expertise and program. And so this in-lieu fee project was, it's in its 5th year of monitoring now, a half acre of eelgrass restoration, 2 quarter-acre areas. There's actually 3, because one got wiped out in a storm in 2018, and then there was some replanting, and that seems to be coming back too. Ecological, so talking about ecological metrics, so what are we looking at here? We're looking at, in comparison to reference sites as well, we're looking at survival rates, density, canopy height. To what degree is the eelgrass persisting over time and expanding? There's a second project that we're working with our Division of Marine Fisheries, where some of the conversation that has been happening is where best to plant eelgrass and to try and increase the chances of long-term survival. So we're also, some of the in-lieu fee money has also been used to support a site suitability study and test planting at other sites throughout the north, central, and south coastal areas in Massachusetts. And based on that study, in the next year or 2, we'll have a better idea about where best to for the continued efforts. We're also working with the Nantucket Land Council, another NGO, on eelgrass restoration in Nantucket Harbor, expanding on some non-mitigation kind of work they've already been doing. And this is a 1 acre project, 2 half-acre sites in the harbor, closer to shore than the Salem one, and more shallow waters. It's in its just first year of monitoring, and so far survival looks good. One of the things, similar metrics, they also did some seeding here, and as well as the shoots. One of the things just wanted to highlight here that we're thinking about as this work progresses is site protection, and how do you do that in tidal areas where you have dynamic system and where you have multiple conflicting uses. So in a way, the site selection, we look at the conflicting uses too. but looking at ways to try and protect these sites over time. So on the next project I want to talk about is the Yarmouth Artificial Reef. So just to give you an idea here on the scale of this, we're talking about a 2-acre area with about 0.7 acres of structure. Our Division of Marine Fisheries had already been doing some work on planning for reef structures and had permitted a larger site area. There was, some donation of clean concrete material that became available. Thank you. Our Division of Marine Fisheries took that on as the project sponsor for this in-lieu fee mitigation program, and they contracted out to do the deployment of the materials. Just a little bit on, how do we know whether this is, successful or not? So when we're doing the project, we have both like contract performance standards as well as ecological performance standards. And some of the discussions that happened, there was somebody mentioned something yesterday about, and maybe it was Bose, was it about, attraction versus productivity? And in the conversations in reviewing this project early on with the IRT, those kinds of questions came up. How do we know that this will actually not just attract fish, and maybe it'll have some recreational fisheries but benefit, but what will the ecological lift really be? So both the species diversity and production are factors that are being considered here for both mobile and sessile species. And we're going into our 3rd year of monitoring on this project, and DMF has some nice videos online too from their monitoring. Just one other example to give you before I finish up here is on oyster reef, and I've been hearing about some of the problems with oyster populations and water quality, of course. So this is another interesting project that had some conversation with the Corps and the IRT early on as to is this an appropriate mitigation project? Is it somewhat maybe experimental? But we felt there was a need and there was a good potential. So this project involves an oyster reef, a small oyster reef, about 0.17 acres, in Pulpus Harbour here off Nantucket. And a part of the goals for this include both salt marsh restoration and the oyster reef itself. So kind of multiple benefits here. The problem at this site was that there was about an acre of salt marsh had been completely denuded of vegetation because of purple crab infestation. Also in an area where it's dealing with sea level rise, storm surge. So the goal here was to test out building this oyster reef and seeing how can it buffer the marsh and help while the restoration work is going on in parallel. Looking here for the oyster reef itself, oyster survival and density, and with the salt marsh, the extent to which we're getting revegetation and planting, where we need to supplement that. Probably I'm out of time, but just some pictures here, just of the establishment of the salt reef. The top right-hand one is some of the photos recently from the 1-year monitoring stage. So anyway, I'm going to kind of leave it here for now. But before I finish, just a couple of things that I didn't mention that I think just might be good to think about is restoration costs and the cost per credit. And when we're doing restoration under the in-lieu fee program, when we're thinking about how much we have to do, it's not just a one-for-one. So in order to get that no net loss, there's multipliers and ratios. So if we've taken in payments for 1 acre, we may be trying to restore 3 acres or enhance 5 or 10 acres, to account for uncertainties, the time lag, and also uncertainties and the time lag, and just the potential for to make sure that we will achieve the no net loss. But obviously, when you take into account all these other potential benefits of these sites, I think there is an opportunity. There's probably other ecological benefits and metrics that we're not necessarily measuring. And I will leave it there for now. Okay, thanks.
So when you have the fee program, right, like do you have like a fee tables in the database? You just grab them, or actually you hire experts like Jason to calculate the fees for you?
Good, interesting question. And I was also thinking myself, as Jason was talking, that I am very interested to find out more information about the kinds of restoration cost analysis and data that you might have. But as we're in developing the fees, so before my time, when the program was being established, the fees were developed by the sponsor, by Department of Fish and Game, which we also do review, obviously with the core, has some input in the IRT and comment on that. So we have a fee table set up. And so just as an example, it's, for wetlands restoration, the fee is like, for wetlands credits, both fresh and tidal right now, it's like $14.26 per square foot, which is about $621,000 per acre. And the stream credits are a different cost. So those costs are already established, and they're based on linear feet. The costs were based at the time on best available information for our region on what it would cost to completely restore, to create a new or completely restore like an acre of wetlands. Now, as we've been doing this over time, we're in the process of doing a 10-year review, evaluation, and update of our instrument, which is our comprehensive planning framework to meet all those requirements from the mitigation rule. We're reevaluating that. We're also reevaluating the costs. It's not as easy to get data on, the costs as one might think or hope. So we're in the process of an early stage on that, looking at different types of restoration projects like dams, salt marshes, cranberry bogs, and we'll be building in more on the coastal and the eelgrass. So we're trying to develop that in a better way going forward because we want to do full cost accounting. What is the true cost of this, and how do we take into account inflation factors and things like that going forward? And then, do we need to adjust the fees? Do we need to think about different costs for tidal versus, freshwater? So we're in the process of that.
NRDR projects, I think, generally are pretty independent. So it'll be like a specific damage caused, by a party in a specific location, and then the restoration happens. And it is sort of specific to that project. And I'm wondering how you think the NRDR process could scale to much larger impacts like the Deepwater Horizon, or to like an entire industry like offshore wind, and what sort of the challenges and opportunities are for implementing that NRDR process on a larger and more sort of integrated scale.
So I'll focus on offshore wind instead of Deepwater Horizon, simply because Deepwater Horizon was a NRD. I think that's me with the feedback. So, I think relative to scale, it is getting down to, again, understanding at the resource or ecological service level what your impacts are and what your level of restoration options are. And for me, specifically, not as an ecologist, but just thinking through the conversations that we have with ecologists, I look at something like Aspen is describing yesterday relative to birds, and I can get my head around that in terms of what I would say is larger scale restoration projects taking place a long way away to potentially mitigate against bird strikes in California, as opposed to what do we do to create and scale habitat restoration projects for right whales. That seems to me to be much harder. And again, if there are, this is me speaking as an economist, so if there are ecologists in the room, we got the right whales figured out relative to restoration projects. But I think that, that element of how they scale to an individual species is really important. And relative to an industry, I guess what I would say is, what is the measurement of your baseline level of services that exist? I think Grover was maybe talking about yesterday, or one of the other speakers was talking about, there's a lot that's happening, and it's happening very fast. And what that means from a measurement standpoint is, what's our baseline? And so what are we doing now to try and collect compile, organize in one location as much data as possible, so that when we go to evaluating impacts, we can think about how much do we have to scale relative to how big do we think those impacts are, and what's the level of restoration that we need for them.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Somebody over here had a question. Is anybody? Somebody over here? Okay.
Hiya. I do slightly struggle with the single species kind of concept because, I mean, your example of a right whale is actually an interesting one. I mean, one thing where you could compensate for a right whale is by trying to maybe take off the pressure off the food resources for that right whale and all the other conflicts elsewhere in the sea. I mean, you've talked about really big systems. And I think what I'm worried about with the compensation is how do you decide, so I mean, there's the valuation bit, which is one side, but there's the compensation. How do you decide where you're going to compensate? It's just the in-kind thing. I suppose we just have so much damage in the marine system that to say that you're going to compensate off-site and off-kind seems like an opportunity lost. And I really sort of worry about that sets a precedent. Maybe it's just that you don't have so much damage offshore as we do. Is that why you wouldn't push to go offshore? I guess I'm just trying to get my head around and ask you, why would you not try and compensate offshore, even if you can't do it absolutely in the location that you're in?
And when you say offshore, like not have the restoration projects take place offshore?
No, I mean have them take place offshore. I suppose we've heard a lot about sort of restoring inshore, restoring sort of in estuarine areas, or restoring, you know, that kind of came out quite strongly. But those aren't the areas where an offshore wind farm is going to be impacting on the local ecosystem. So why would you not go offshore?
My intention, I used an inshore example relative to log perch, but that's just because that's an example. There's no offshore wind that's taking place in Eden, North Carolina. The idea relative to resources and services, the resources and services that are happening offshore, and where does it make the most effect to do the most impact to do those restoration projects? My point from a damage assessment process relative to an individual species is all about measurement. In terms of what have we lost, what can we measure, what are we trying to improve, how do we measure the improvements that we've made? And I think, relative to what I was listening to you describe yesterday was, look, there's so much uncertainty relative to damage and restoration that trying to get down to that specifically is not as good as creating a general fund, a payment system that can look at things more holistically. And I think that, I understand the concept and the intent perfectly. I think that in looking at the practical aspect of a regulatory process, a developer who is out there trying to make something happen relatively quickly in terms of goals for building offshore wind, there's a question of how do we incentivize them to take on certain projects to make sure that those improvements happen to the best that they can. So there's a debate there that I think is very important to voice and to have and to think through, what our options are.
So on that note, I have a couple comments. One, I wouldn't know what offshore mitigation would be for a whale species, right? I'm a terrestrial wetland ecologist. But I always tend to take that holistic view of what is most needed for aquatic ecosystems relative to, what's being impacted or the distance of what's being impacted. And so for me, the first thing that came to mind was all of those coastal resources that are sorely underfunded and have lost. So that was number one for me. Number two, we have precedent of where off-site is often better than on-site, or typically better than on-site. This may be completely different from the marine system, but better than on-site because you can have a better site selection with buffer areas, with more protections, with more connectivity and whatnot, right? If you do it off-site versus next to a development area. And so as a terrestrial example for off-site and out of kind would be there's no potential for replacing ephemeral first, second, third order ephemeral streams in the arid west. You can't recreate those somewhere. You can't recreate their drainage watershed, their sediment transport. You just can't. So we had to figure out a way, an alternative to that, which was I've accepted vernal pool ecosystem restoration for ephemeral stream impacts. I can't compare the functions of an ephemeral stream to an ephemeral vernal pool, apples to apples, but I know vernal pools are also ephemeral, that they support endangered species, that they are in huge need of restoration and preservation. And so that to me made sense. Or restoration in sort of larger order systems, the intermittent perennial receiving water bodies of these, right? The 7th, 8th, order systems. That made more sense than trying to get, and we have counterparts across the core that have required in kind. And we have drainage ditches on the sides of cut mountains in West Virginia on coal mining, 2-to-1 slopes that were used as mitigation for ephemeral stream impacts. They do nothing. There's like no ecological value there at all. So for me, the alternative was get something that does something versus nothing. And regulators, if we push too hard for the perfect, for the on-site, the in-kind, the whatever, and it can't happen or it can't happen reasonably or practicably, we get nothing. I mean, I can show you the data. We get nothing. So it's either practicable, ecologically sustainable, compensatory mitigation, or nothing. That's just the reality of our regulatory environment in the United States.
Thank you. And so before we headed to lunch, let me just make one point as a sort of a concluding remark. I think we should recognize that the ocean environment is far more dynamic and uncertain. And so this is actually relatively to the terrestrial examples, something needed to be recognized. And then most of the proposed wind farms and operating wind farms here in the United States in the federal waters, so that's involving even more complex regulatory framework, and the natural environment, as I repeat, is a very dynamic, very uncertain. The species are mobile, so those are all the some challenges we have to deal with on this particular issue. So now it's 1 o'clock and it's time for lunch. Let's before we go, a round of applause. Thank our panelists.